useful. And some time ago, in late October, we launched something which we called, my friend and colleague, Jeffrey Goldfarb, and I from PCBS, we launched an initiative which is called Flying Seminar. Flying Seminar was for us an effort, and at the first place a space to create for carving out a little bit of time and quieter space than downtown in Supporting Park to talk about the issues related to the Occupy Wall Street movement, and in a way trying to think things through together. And for us, it was an opportunity to learn, and I think for everybody, in fact, it was an opportunity to learn. We thought that we could invite here people who could illuminate some of the things because of their past and because of their engagement and because of what they know, that could help us to think together. Then this is the mission. The mission is modest, but but sometimes the outcomes, like the one that we had in the past, were quite surprisingly not so modest. And we started with our first meeting was with a crew of Japanese protesters, anti-nuke protesters, who arrived in New York, and they wanted to join the Occupy movement in order to bring back the experience to their own movement that they established in Tokyo, which had to do with what had happened after the tsunami and the nuclear disaster in Japan this spring. That was quite extraordinary meeting for us. We did not realize, very many of us did not realize that in fact this is the very first movement that began to appear in public places with such a in a kind of systematic way of Japan that was not done before. The second meeting, on a very surprisingly snow Saturday, on October 30th, was with Adam Michnik, a Polish troublemaker, and so were the actually Japanese people. So I think we are kind of faithful to the tradition because this is really to talk with people who think otherwise or who think out of the box. Adam Michnik was not only a political prisoner, who is a very insightful writer and analyst, who is a person who stands for the nonviolent revolutions, and who came really to listen and to learn. And those of you who are interested can actually enter our website and see the meeting recorded by Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. So here we are today, and you know whom we have today. You know it because this is why you came, and it's an incredible privilege to have you with us, Bill. And I wanted to thank RAND and the Institute for Humanities at NYU and Stephanie for making that connection. The connections are key here. And also Institute of Public Culture at NYU. There are people, there's an interest, and in fact we are so close together. You know, it's good to actually bring those initiatives together. So thank you very much. I think that's something that we benefit. They invited you and we benefit. We all benefit here in New York. And I don't think I need to introduce Bill. Again, he is here because he did write a book, and he is here to talk about this book in New York. And I'm sure that we will be oscillating around the issues that he brought in this book, which is called Troublemaker: Memoirs from the 60s. And I probably didn't say the title exactly as it ought to be. Close enough. So we will be talking around that, but in fact, the idea is to have a larger conversation. I think we are at a crucial moment with the movement. I have been away for a little bit more than 2 weeks, and a lot of things have happened in the meantime, and I don't know where we are going. I don't know where you are going. I don't know where the Occupy movement, Wall Street movement is going, and I know it's what are the directions, what are the possibilities, what has been accomplished, and what could be done. And I'm sure we won't be able to answer those questions, but maybe this is why this meeting is so important today. To help you out, I'd like to go very quickly around the table so he has a sense who's here. And then when we finish, I will ask you to say something, just whatever you want to say, to start our conversation, and then we'll go to the conversation.
Good.
So you know about me. I want to say I'm Polish, but I'm really American, so I don't know what I wanted to say, and I live here in New York, and I teach at the institute.
And your recent book is on performing politics or performative politics?
Yeah, I'm into performative democracy. I believe in that kind of democracies which are not just procedural, but the dimensions which are missing. And I think that one of the reasons that we have to do, and we have to have movement the way we have that kind of movement is because this dimension is missing in American life, but not only in American democracy.
Stephanie Seiker, the New York Institute of Humanities, at which Bill Zimmerman gave a wonderful talk yesterday and spurred a great and very engaged discussion. I'm sure the same will be true for today.
Philip Dre, I'm a historian of American civil rights history.
Jan Gross, I'm a former 1968 troublemaker from Poland, lived here, in fact, on the Holocaust.
Anna Anderson, and I'm an attorney at the ACLU, and I happen to be Phil's daughter.
I'm Ian Johnson. I'm first and foremost I'm his boyfriend, so if you're familiar with Bill's family.
Great pedigree, all of that.
Professionally, I spent the better part of the last 4 years working for the president and now the general counsel at OWS. And I've been out of the country for most of the Occupy Wall Street movement. I've been in Europe, but I was at the Occupy sites in Edinburgh, Glasgow, Belfast, Paris, and one other city over there. So I have some insight as to what they were doing, but not what's going on.
My name is Francisca Keller. I'm a PhD student in politics at NYU. I'm interested in authoritarian regimes and opposition movements.
Oh, sorry.
Francisca Keller from NYU Politics Department, PhD. I'm interested in authoritarian regimes and opposition movements.
Francisca, you've been in the prior. No? You have not been in a prior seminar?
No.
There was another Francisca from NYU, that I remember that. It's not so common thing.
I'm Randy Weschler, Lawrence Weschler. I'm the director of the American Institute for the Humanities, but more pertinently, perhaps, I was I'm a reporter for the New York for many years. I chronicled upsurges in Poland and Bosnia and South Africa, Latin America, and so forth.
I'm his daughter.
She happens to be.
Yeah. I'm the daughter of another Polish troublemaker. And I've been working in northern Uganda with a local NGO that does resocialization of combatants, but I also watched a popular movement fizzle out in Uganda for lack of direction. It was sad and interesting. And I'm sad.
We're just introducing ourselves. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kay, PhD student at the sociology department here. I'm working on my 1968 movement in Japan.
And you brought us Japanese students here, Japanese protesters here.
Hi, my name is Pavlina Marushova, and I'm a PhD student in the politics department here at the New School.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm also a politics student here at the institute.
So she's Czech, she's Romanian, just so you know how incredibly international we are here.
I'm Eli Bleish. I'm a professor here at the New School in Media and Culture. I teach a class called Weapons of Mass Communication. I've known Bill for 40 or 45 years. I shouldn't say that. We worked together on the Harold Washington campaign. I was in 1980. I was in the White House, the Carter White House at the end of that as a media consultant. And I'm here because I'm interested in the applications and listening to what you have to say about applications of media to the success of these, any kind of things, actually, how vital they are.
My name is Jaroslav Andel. I am the artistic director of the Center for Contemporary Art in Prague, but I also live in New York. And the reason why I'm here is that I just organized a large exhibition in Prague, which includes sections on early occupational movements in Europe. and I would love.
My name is Mark. I'm an artist, and I've been with the Occupied movement since October.
My name is Tim Weldon. I'm an occupier as well, heavily involved in think tank and continuing my flirtation with academia.
My name is Richard Mohammed. I'm a think tank participant, and I've been involved in the civil rights, quote unquote, social justice movements in the African American community for over 15 years. I'm also a sustainability consultant.
I'm Marlene Nagel. I'm another troublemaker from the 60s who spent most of the decade either writing the sort of movements for the Village Voice or demonstrating when I put my notebook down. I continue to write about what I used to refer to as lost causes, but I think given Occupy Wall Street, I need a return.
My name is Esther Gardner. I'm a PhD student in social work department here at the school, and I'm mainly here also to cover for the Indian Consider.
Well, first of all, I'm Bill Zimmerman, and I want to thank all of you for using the word troublemaker so often because it helps promote the book that I've just published with that title. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself than you've all announced about yourselves, because I want to give you a sense of 50 years of trying to do what you guys are doing in various forms, and see if anything in that experience might be helpful to you in terms of figuring out where to go or what to do. So, briefly, I started trying to change America in Mississippi in 1962 in the voter registration campaign that was sponsored by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which was the more militant of the four civil rights groups that built and managed the Southern Civil Rights Movement. Following that experience, I spent 10 years in the anti-war movement, starting out as a student activist, but after 10 years becoming one of the national leaders of the movement. The last thing I did in the anti-war movement was run an organization called Medical Aid for Indochina. And that organization might be interesting in the present context because the problem that we tried to address in forming that organization was the problem of the movement having moved so fast, it got too far ahead of the public that wanted to support it. We had created a situation halfway through. The war was 10 years long. And after protesting for 5 years and being unable to stop the war, we had become increasingly militant, anti-capitalist, and revolutionary. At the same time, a majority of the country had turned against the war, but was unable to relate to us because we were far more militant than they were willing to be. And by militant, I mean everything from setting bombs off in the State Department to very forceful demonstrations on the street in which we engaged the police with violence. We would eventually go to demonstrations wearing motorcycle helmets and carrying shields and batons and being ready to engage in street fighting. Obviously, that was not something that most Americans could relate to. So we faced a crisis in 1971 in which we had created a majority against the war, but we couldn't lead people because we had become too militant. So a number of alternative organizations were created in order to develop tactics that more people could relate to. So I developed one of those organizations, which is called Medical Aid for Indochina. And what we did was raise money in this country and use it to buy medical supplies, surgical equipment, and so forth. And we sent that medical equipment to civilians in the enemy part of the country, what the North Vietnam. I mean, obviously they weren't our enemy, but they were the enemy of the U.S. government. So for several years, we conducted a campaign and eventually raised millions of dollars because people responded to the idea of a humanitarian gesture having this sharply confrontational aspect to it. We were raising money for medicines, but we were giving it to the so-called enemy. And nobody in this country, and I don't know about other countries, but nobody in this country that had done anything like that tried to create support for the other side. When the war ended, we decided to run one of the leaders of the anti-war movement, Tom Hayden, for the United States Senate, thinking that between the damage done to the U.S. government's credibility in the Watergate scandal, which occurred in 72 to 74, and the defeat in Indochina, that the American electorate might be ready for an alternative candidacy of that sort. I wound up managing the campaign. We didn't win, we came close, but in the course of managing that campaign, I mastered some of the techniques of electoral politics and began to do that professionally and for the progressive forces in this country, such as they were at that time. So in the over the course of the next maybe 7 or 8 years, between 76 and 86, 10 years, I did a number of visible electoral campaigns in the United States that were, for the most part, successful. We elected, as Eli indicated before, the first African-American mayor of Chicago, Harold Washington, in a very heavily contested and racially charged election. We helped elect, and at that time, Harold was the highest black elected official in the United States. In '82, we elected a Hispanic governor of New Mexico, who was then the highest ranking Hispanic elected official in the country. In the mid-'80s, I worked on Gary Hart's presidential campaign and a few senatorial and congressional races around the country. But I quickly became impatient with electing candidates to office because the Congress was very difficult to move without seniority. You know, you get these guys in the Congress, and they're good guys, but it takes them 15 years to become chair people of subcommittees or committees where they have any real influence. So I made a shift after the '86 election and started doing ballot initiatives. And I think that I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of those ballot initiatives because it may be more apropos to where you guys might go. Ballot initiatives are probably the most, the best expression of direct democracy that we have in our system. You may not be familiar with them here in New York because New York doesn't allow them, but there are 23 states in the United States that allow citizen initiatives in which citizens can write laws, petition to put those laws on the ballot, and then enact those laws with a majority vote without any other part of the government being involved. That is, you don't have to go through the legislature.
Is New York one of those?
No, it is not. Most of the states,
you say 33 states, right?
23 states have this process. Most of them are in the western United States because the process comes out of the populist movement at the turn of the 20th century, when the populists got control of state governments, which happened primarily in the western states because the populist movement was agriculturally based. They created this process. There are 6 states, I believe, east of the Mississippi that have the process: Ohio, Michigan, Florida, Massachusetts, Maine, and Mississippi. The other 17 states are all west of Mississippi. But in any case, in '86, I decided that being impatient with the whole electoral congressional process, I decided to try this as a way of creating progressive law without the encumbrance of government. And we did a hell of a job over the next 20 years. I mean, the first thing we did was in California. We passed an initiative that regulated the automobile insurance industry. This was an issue that allowed us to bring right and left together, liberals and conservatives. Everyone's pissed off about the cost of automobile insurance. So we created a set of regulations that required the insurance companies to get prior approval before they could increase prices on people. And that prior approval came from a new statewide elective office we created called Insurance Commissioner. So that Insurance Commissioner was responsible to the people who had elected him or her rather than being a gubernatorial appointment, which is how it worked in the past. Well, long story short, we defeated a campaign sponsored by the insurance industry to block this initiative that entailed $80 million. Now, this was $80 million in 1988, so it's probably spent against it. So it's probably the equivalent of $200 million today in terms of constant dollars. We had $2 million, and we beat them because we had something that everybody wanted. Everybody wanted their auto insurance to be less. People were suspicious of any messages coming from the industry itself, so their propaganda was much less effective than our arguments against it. The Consumers Union did a assessment 2 years ago about the impact of this initiative over the 20 years between 1988 when we passed it and 2008, and concluded that we had transferred $63 billion from the insurance industry to consumers over the course of those 20 years. That is, we had reduced by roughly $3 billion a year the collective cost of automobile insurance in California. So having achieved that, we started focusing on ballot initiatives. And we've done a lot. And you know, when I say we, I'm just talking about my own company. There are plenty of other people doing these things across the country as well. But just to give you a sense of this, perhaps the most relevant of all the initiatives we did was in 2004 when we put a 1% surtax on income over $1 million in California. The mental health community came to us and asked us to try to create a fund to support mental health services for the homeless, mentally ill in California, and for at-risk school children, at risk for psychological reasons. You know, these two populations are always last in line when the legislature is trying to figure out how to dole out money. And in a time of fiscal restraint, the cuts fall on populations of that sort. Mr. Chair. So the initial proposal, or the initial request to us was, let's do an initiative that creates some kind of sin tax that'll fund these programs, you know, tax on alcohol, tax on tobacco, something like that, which had been tried many times in California and sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed. But we came up with the notion of, let's go after people who have too much money and see if we can get the public to support making them pay for these services. So we did a little research on how much money was involved and whether it would be sufficient to cover this program, et cetera, et cetera. But long story short, we put an initiative on the ballot that created a 1% surtax on income over $1 million and mandated all that money go into these mental health programs. The initiative won, and the amount of money generated, and this is the important point I want to get across, the amount of money generated was $1.8 billion. Now, think about what that means.
That's a year.
1 year, every year. So every year since 2004, because of this initiative, there's about $1.8 billion going into these programs that otherwise wouldn't be there, and that's paid for entirely by people with incomes over $1 million a year. This is not a tax on wealth, it's a tax on income. So the public supported this, and you can imagine the arguments against it. Rich people will leave California, we'll lose jobs, the state will collapse. The public didn't buy that. That's the first point. Second point is the amount of money. I mean, that's how many. You guys have made very effectively made the point about the amount
just for a second. And did the quality of services improve rapidly if you look at how these monies were spent?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, you can't suddenly throw $1.8 billion at a social problem and assume that within a few weeks or even a year that that money can be efficiently spent. So the buildup in terms of spending the money was slow because new infrastructure had to be created in order to digest such a large amount of money and spend it efficiently. So I would say it took maybe 2 to 3 years before a really good system for delivering services was created, but eventually it was.
It's in place.
Yeah, and it's in place. It's been in place for a while. But the potential for money that can be raised is enormous. We're just one state, but there are so many people in that one state making over $1 million a year that just taking 1% of the amount over, and this is a tax only on the income over $1 million, not on the other income. So other initiatives we did all the
wealth versus income tax. That was interesting about taxing wealth rather than.
Well, that was one of the confusions in the campaign that we had to explain to the public, is that this wasn't a tax on wealth. Because one of the resistances we encountered was people who, this was 2004, the real estate market is still hot. A lot of people had homes worth $1 million. So the anxiety they felt was, oh my God, you're going to tax me because my house is worth $1 million. So we had to get across the difference between a tax on wealth or assets and a tax on income. But we succeeded in doing that.
And the money that was generated by that was specifically from the very beginning promised to be the money that would be directed to the mental health issues and problems.
Yeah, in California, and this isn't true in all of the initiative states, but in California, the legislature cannot change, modify, or overrule a citizen-passed initiative.
Okay.
If an initiative is passed by a vote of the people, it can only be modified by a vote of the people, not by the legislature. In other states, the legislature can come in after a decent interval. Some states it's 2 years, some states it's 4 years, and make some changes. But we have found over the years when legislatures do try to change initiatives that have been passed by the public, they're subject to public anger. Hey, we voted for this. What the hell are you doing changing it? It becomes an issue when those legislators are up for re-election. So they're willing to make changes because obviously they get a lot of lobbying money and corporate money to try to influence them to make those changes. But there's a countervailing force, which is it's an issue that can be used against them in their next re-election. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on initiatives, but there's a lot you can do. Social issues, economic issues, all kinds of issues. I mean, we're the people responsible for medical marijuana.
I thought so. Yeah.
Does that mean you have a question?
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar
No.
with
Yeah. No.
Clarifying question.
Okay.
And when we do this, we're.
Yeah, I know what that is. I know what that is.
That's question. I
Yes,
don't know.
clarifying question.
Okay.
I'm just curious, how close are we to having these ballot initiatives across America and
Well, it's very difficult to create the process in a state that doesn't already have it. Because the only way to create it is through the government, and the government doesn't want it.
Right.
In those states that have the initiative process, legislators hate it because it takes both money and power away from them. If corporations have to put $50 million into a campaign to fight a progressive initiative, that's $50 million that isn't going to legislators for their re-election campaigns. So they're very resistant to this process, and I don't know that we can expand it beyond those 23 states, unless there's some kind of massive crisis.
Can I add something
Sure.
that you probably are aware of? Mike Gravel, you all remember him, Senator Mike Gravel from Alaska, who also ran for president briefly, has been working and trying to produce a national initiative, which would deal with our Congress and our Senate as opposed to state by state. And I saw something come by not too long ago that some legislation in the Congress has moved them even closer. That would allow you to run this sort of thing on national issues as opposed to state by state. It would be something that you should probably look into and try to support or find out about.
Is this the same process and system that produced Proposition 8 and other majority
Yes.
voting on the rights of minorities?
Yes, yes. I mean, you know, this process is just like any other in politics. It becomes an arena of struggle. It's not something that the left can control or the right can control. And you know, there has been plenty of damage done to America by ballot initiatives. The most important one being Proposition 13 in California in 1978, which began this whole tax revolt across the country and empowered the Republican Party with, you know, the issue of reducing taxes. You had a question?
Yeah, because I'm from California and I know about the whole medical marijuana industry was going on. Enlighten us as to the pushback that's coming from the federal government right now, based on the fact that Californians voted this in, and yet the federal government is now coming with some serious.
Yeah. Well, you know, we were accused in 1996 when we passed the first medical marijuana initiative of putting it on the ballot as a stalking horse for legalizing marijuana. Within the confines of this room, that was a valid critique. But in terms of the public campaign that we did, you know, it was designed to help medical patients who needed marijuana as a medicine. And we won that initiative and immediately put it on the ballot in 6 other states the following election cycle, and we won all of those. Now, it did turn out that medical marijuana does lead people to think more about legalizing marijuana. And polling shows that the best argument for legalizing marijuana is if you know somebody who's used marijuana medically. Those are the people who are easiest to convert over to the legalization side. Well, the federal government does the same kind of polling that we do, and they understand the underlying dynamic. In California, the law that we passed was very loose, and it allowed for the creation of dispensaries that could sell marijuana on a retail level. And once the lid was taken off and people had the ability to do that, these dispensaries proliferated massively. 2 years ago, we had 800 just within the city of Los Angeles. Within the city limits, 800 dispensaries. So every neighborhood had multiple retail outlets that were selling marijuana.
More than Starbucks. No, we took one stuff. You got more dispensaries in LA than Starbucks.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Imagine that in New York.
Well, imagine it in LA. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you know. Anyway, this was generating now something entirely unexpected. $150 million a year in sales tax. Jobs for thousands of people.
Growers, dryers, packers.
Well, you know, the growers were always growing.
Right.
But the retail outlets were employing, you know, lots of people as well. So, you know, what happened is that the marijuana use got normalized in people's and last year, had a full legalization initiative on the ballot and got 46%, which was much more than anybody thought was possible. And following that 46% vote on the 2010 ballot, the federal government started cracking down. And yeah.
I'm just curious with the federal government, what necessarily would be their sort of motivation to crack down on? I mean, I'm just curious. Why is the federal government the enemy against California's legalization?
Well, I think the real question is why is the federal government the enemy of marijuana legalization? And I don't have an answer to that because it is the most irrational public policy I've ever come across. They have marijuana, you know, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the FDA has a schedule of all pharmaceuticals in the country, and they're divided into schedules, Schedule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Schedule 1, most dangerous, Schedule 5, safest. So Schedule 5 drugs you can buy over the counter, like aspirin. Schedule 1 drugs are supposed to be drugs that have a high potential for abuse and no medical use. Schedule 2 drugs are high potential for abuse, some medical use. So in Schedule 2, you have cocaine, heroin, morphine, opium, and in Schedule 1, you have marijuana. Now, why is that? Who the fuck knows?
How else are you going to fund all the revolutions in
Well, I think the real reason that marijuana is in Schedule 1, anyway, this is just a hypothesis, but the real reason that it's in Schedule 1 is that it's fun. And fun is very subversive.
The Protestants.
Fun is subversive, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's an absolutely harmless drug, and the fact that in a society in which it's illegal and you can go to jail for it, 15% of the population nonetheless regularly uses it. You know, I mean, this is just like alcohol prohibition in the 20s. It's a law against something that a sizable portion of the population engages in. So I think the feds feel that if they take the lid off, everybody will do it. Obviously, the alcohol industry is concerned about, you know, everyone's preferred intoxicants moving from alcohol to something more natural. So I think there are a lot of forces involved.
But why is it wrong?
Well, you know, I think you got to understand that in terms of all the pressures on the president, not the president's personal preferences. I can't believe that Obama, who admitted to marijuana use and cocaine use, feels ideologically opposed to this. But, you know, he must feel under enormous pressure. The DEA, the FBI, these people have years of investment in enforcing these laws. The alcohol industry has a financial stake in it, so he's sitting in the middle of it. Yeah, big pharma, sure.
I have a, go ahead.
Sorry. So you made a proposition for the legalization of marijuana, or your organization did, and you said that 46% was higher than you expected.
Yeah.
So obviously you didn't expect to have it passed.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. I was opposed to putting that initiative on the ballot because people put it on the ballot at the wrong time. They put it on the 2010 ballot. They should have waited until 2012 when the electorate was larger, more diverse, more liberal, and so forth. But these were people who had made a lot of money in a marijuana dispensary in Oakland, and they just decided to ignore the advice of the people who had experience with ballot initiatives. They thought, oh, you know, we can do this, it's behind us.
So they thought that they would win?
Yeah, so they put it on the ballot thinking they would win, and those of us who had, you know, done this a bunch of times in a bunch of other states said, don't do it now, you're going to lose, wait till 2012. So they did it, and they lost, and I think they made it harder for it to pass now.
So you...
Ian?
I just wanted to throw in one possible consideration on why the federal government might be cracking down, which is that I think it's important to remember, obviously, that you have both the Congress that makes the laws and the executive that's tasked with enforcing the laws that are on the books. And if the disagreement is why is the federal government scheduling marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug, or why is the federal government criminalizing it, that's a question of what are the laws that Congress has passed. Once the laws are passed, you know, the executive obviously has some level of prosecutorial discretion and can prioritize how it wants to use its resources, but it is at least constitutionally obligated to enforce the laws that are on the books. And if it appears that the laws that are on the books are simply being unenforced, then the executive has a concern about the just general legal structure in the country and general people's perspective of the law. So I suspect some of what's going on in the executive branches, look, we have an obligation to enforce the laws, and if we start seeing the laws are just being overly flouted, there's a threat to the overall structure. It's less of a decision probably about whether we think marijuana is destructive or we want to go after. And I also think that probably some of what the executive is trying to do, both in the immigration context and in the marijuana context, is strike some balance between saying, look, we don't make the laws, we have to enforce them, but we have some disagreement with some of the policies, so let's try to calibrate our enforcement in a more balanced way. And so I think there's probably a little bit of executive just saying, look, this is the law. And if we want to change it, we have to direct that objection to Congress to change what the law is. But
yeah, thanks. I think that's right. I think that's absolutely right.
And I think as long as the threshold is still 46%, Congress is not going to.
No, Congress won't move on this issue until we get to 70%.
Right.
Yeah. Now, let me just tell you about one other initiative, and then we can get off the initiative process, because it had a much greater impact than the medical marijuana. It was also a drug policy initiative, but had much greater impact than medical marijuana. In the year 2000, we passed an initiative in California that mandated the state to provide drug treatment to people arrested the first or second time for drug possession. And it prevented the state from incarcerating those people. And that's for all drugs, heroin, methamphetamine, whatever. If you're arrested for possession the first 2 times, the state's got to put you in treatment, cannot incarcerate you. And we appropriated, in passing that initiative, $120 million annually to pay for the treatment. Now, when that initiative passed in the year 2000, 35,000 people a year who had previously been incarcerated were not incarcerated. So in the 10 years since it's passed, 350,000 people who otherwise would have gone to jail have not. Equally important, the state saved $200 million a year because the cost of treatment is $4,000 a year and the cost of incarceration is $40,000 a year.
But prison lobby did not like it.
Pardon me?
Prison lobby.
No, prison lobby was opposed to it. We beat them in the campaign. I mean, they were the opposition in the campaign. And the prison lobby in California is the prison guards as well as the private prison industry. So anyway, all of that is just by way of telling you that we have been trying to use the system to create progressive laws and legislation and progressive movements in a variety of ways over the years. In addition to this kind of electoral work that I've been doing, we also did a lot of activist work, trying to capture some of these skills from the electoral arena and apply them to activist movements. So in the mid-'80s, we raised movements in this country against U.S. intervention in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Reagan was the president. There were revolutionary movements, a successful one in Nicaragua, one that did not succeed in El Salvador. But in both instances, the president wanted to intervene militarily. And we were able to use the memory of Vietnam, which at that time was only 12, 15 years before, in order to raise popular movements against military intervention. And we were successful in blocking for over a period of about 8 years, U.S. military forces intervening directly. If you remember, Reagan could not send the U.S. military into Nicaragua. Instead, he had to create an army called the Contras out of other populations hired to fight in this army out of Central America. And eventually that army was defeated by the Sandinista revolutionaries in Nicaragua. In El Salvador, there was a revolutionary movement that tried to take power, were neutralized by the United States, but the United States couldn't intervene sufficiently to defeat them, and eventually the United Nations negotiated a truce between the two sides in 1991, and the revolutionaries formed a political party and fought in the electoral arena, and 2 years ago achieved victory, and now the president of El Salvador is a former member of these revolutionary forces. None of this would have happened if there wasn't a movement in the United States to stop that. More recently, and maybe more interesting in terms of the present context, From 2003 to 2008, I produced television commercials for MoveOn.org and helped them grow from 300,000 online activists to 5 million over the course of those 5 years. And we did it in an interesting way that had never been done before. One of the most common complaints about the political process in the United States is its reliance on 30-second television commercials. And people not only complain about the commercials as such, but they're offended by the content of the commercials. They see the commercials as strident, uninformative, and you have to understand that these commercials are being directed to the part of our population that's least informed politically, undecided voters. If you're still undecided in an election 2 or 3 weeks before the election, it means you haven't been paying attention or you don't care about the outcome. So the commercials that are designed to move these people of necessity have to be pretty simple-minded because and emotional and manipulative, because the population we're trying to move isn't interested or motivated. That offends the rest of the society, and people sit around saying, gee, I wish, I could get my kind of commercial on the air, or I wish there was a commercial that would come on there that would express, how I felt. So we took advantage of that in building MoveOn. MoveOn was able to create enough money to hire us to actually make finished television commercials that expressed how progressives felt. This was, we started doing this in 2003, so this was the build-up to defeating Bush in 2004, and it was based primarily on feelings of opposition to the war in Iraq, which at that point was months, began in March 2003, so this was in the period immediately after that, leading up to the 2004 election. So we made commercials that were anti-war, strongly anti-Bush, very powerfully anti-Bush. And we emailed those commercials to the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people that MoveOn had on its list. And we said, you want to, look at this commercial. This email at that point had become capable of transmitting 30-second commercials. And we said, you want to see this on the air? Give us $10, and we'll put it on the air. Well, the response was overwhelming. In the lead up to the 2004 election, we raised $11.5 million that way, and bought $11.5 million. Well, we actually bought $23 million worth of airtime for that $11.5 million because our friend George Soros uptown agreed to match whatever we could raise from the public. So we spent $23 million attacking Bush and trying to help the Kerry campaign defeat him, and we think we succeeded, but the Secretary of State in Ohio stole the election, and if he hadn't stolen the election and we had won Ohio, Bush would have lost the election. But the process was fantastic, and we continued doing it for the next 4 years up to the 2008 election, and more millions of dollars were raised this way. So the lesson was, if you can provide people with political expression that they feel good about, that they desire, that they want to see put out, they want to see their opinions broadcast to the rest of the country, A, they're willing to put up some money for that, and B, they're willing to join an organization that's systematically providing that service to them. And by the 2008 election, we had over 5 million online members. So there's a dynamic there that's interesting, and I think it's not unlike what you guys have achieved in terms of putting this meme into public consciousness about the 1% versus the 99%. That's echoing in the same way that people wanted messages that attacked Bush and were anti-war to echo and bounce around the society during the years we did this with MoveOn. So, I think the internet is providing more opportunities to do things like this. And the only limitation is our imagination and what we can dream up in the way of tactics to try to exploit this new power that we have. I mean, you're all maybe don't remember the 70s and 80s when communicating with people required a postage stamp. And that made it so expensive. I mean, it was unbelievable how much it would cost. If you wanted to reach 1 million people, you had to spend $300,000 or $400,000 just to send them one letter. So the limitation on our ability to communicate with the public was financial because we could never raise the money for postage. Email has solved that problem. It provides now free communication, almost free communication. And we're still catching up with how to exploit that, that new capability. And now, email that can deliver television commercials and films and music, and I mean, it's extraordinary. So anyway, then, I've had all these experiences. I've done this kind of work. We've been struggling against capitalism for 50 years. We haven't always been able to say that that's the objective. Well, okay. I could just speak from my own. It was my 50 years, But we haven't always been able to be overt about it or explicit about it. But there are many ways and paths, in this very complex society that we live in order to get these messages out.
Let me ask you a question, which kind of ties those two kinds of things you were talking about. The first one relates to the broadly understood ballot initiative and its potential. I'm looking at it as a potential, and I'm looking at it as a potential that, when I was a little troublemaker in Poland, we were trying to find out, what is this in the system already? What exists in the system? What kind of promises are there that we can exploit on our own behalf? And actually we can, the system, and therefore had some kind of insight. And I think we was the best kind of master of expressing it. So what I like to ask you is how to translate that very practice that you practice so successfully in California. I'm talking actually about the concept of this ballot initiative. How to use a fresher language. Because what you just told us in the second part of your presentation, when we were talking about the way you dealt with helping people to see a fresh articulation, freshly articulated ideas, that you help them to find themselves at home because it was what they thought, but it was also put in a new, fresh language. I have a problem with ballot initiative. I understand that extraordinary value on that. I'd like to think, I'd like to ask you about it, and I don't know how you guys feel about it, that there is a new language needed to capture the potential of that kind of stuff that exists there, but even very specifically ballot initiative. And a few years ago, we have been celebrating here everywhere the collapse of Berlin Wall, and you mentioned before that laughter is such an incredibly powerful weapon. One of the initiatives which at some point when the opposition was underground and nothing, and it was something was not moving anymore, one of the most interesting initiatives which was imagined and then put into performance was so-called Orange Alternative. Orange Alternative were people who were trying to fight with the regime for laughter, and therefore they created an army of the dwarfs, and it was a dwarf revolution of dwarfs. The dwarfs were arrested on the street, it ridiculed the system, and so on and so on. In 1989, the head of that revolution, his name was Major, doesn't matter, it's actually a pseudonym, Frederick, came to New York in 1989, in November or December, went to Wall Street and kind of made a little, with his friends, a little installation in the Wall Street, which later on was repeated actually. They did a red kind of ribbon around some major buildings and so on. And he then was interviewed on the radio and asked why. He said, well, because different walls collapsed. Berlin Wall collapsed. We are celebrating now the 20th anniversary of the collapse of Berlin Wall. But Wall Street is still there. and it suddenly, it was just ahead of all of us thinking about it, all of you thinking about it. But what I'm trying to say is that sometimes a fresh language, which is kind of, that illuminates the new possibility and helps people to imagine things. Now, you experiencing that. That's why I'm
Well,
hoping that
you know, we did something on Wall Street too that I forgot about 45 years ago. I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but a bunch of anti-war people went up on the balcony above the trading floor and threw a wad, I guess there were $100 bills.
But kind of real?
Yeah, the real money.
Oh,
And they just
that's
threw it
what-
up in the air, and it settled, you know, fluttered down onto the trading floor, and it stopped trading because these greedy traders stopped what they were doing to run around and scoop up, you know, these dollar bills. And, you know, obviously we had alerted the press, so there was television coverage of this. And, you know, for an afternoon, we made the whole Wall Street scene look ridiculous,
Yeah.
you know, and communicated the level of greed that underlay the, but in response to your question, I'm not sure that ballot initiatives are necessarily the right way to go. I think in some places they can be useful, and in these states, by the way, that have these ballot initiatives, they also have city and county initiatives. So you can do things on a very local level. I think it might be a tactic that in certain areas and at certain times would be a way to mobilize the public around an issue, but it's not a national strategy. But there is a national strategy that comes out of the same kind of thinking. The ballot initiative is a way that our political system allows us to collectively go around the government. The idea is going around the government, not necessarily in the way that we're supposed to, through the ballot initiative. There's another way to go around the government, which is a tactic that's very powerful but very underutilized